Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from across the continent and beyond. Welcome. I'm Tiffany Archer, founder and president of Eunomia Global and Eunomia Risk Advisory, and we are so glad to have you here at the table with us today. For those joining us for the first time, the Eunomia Global Executive Roundtable Series is part of our commitment to capacity building and advancing governance, risk, and digital trust across Africa. Our inaugural roundtable on AI in Africa drew nearly 100 participants from more than 20 countries. The conversations that came out of that session made it clear that we need to take the conversation further. Before we dive in, just wanted to note that we really appreciate you dropping your questions in the Q&A throughout, so that we can weave them in and weave them through to create a synergistic experience and a real-time flow. So now let me set the stage for today's roundtable. As we know, the regulatory blueprints are here. And today we're going to find out more about what happens when you architect with purpose. We're going to explore that through three lenses, the first being the implementation gap. Secondly, the tension between sovereignty and cross-border integration. And then finally, how can you govern when you are not fully in control? I'm joined today by three incredible speakers who come at these questions from very different vantage points. So let me first start by introducing our panel. First, we have Teki Akuate. She's the founding executive director of the Africa Digital Rights Hub and chairperson of Ghana's Data Protection Commission. Previously, she served as Ghana's first Data Protection Commission executive director, where she implemented the Data Protection Act. She's also a senior partner at Nsua Akuate & Co. I apologize. She has more than 2 decades of experience in privacy, data protection, digital economy, and cybersecurity across Africa. She was instrumental in developing Ghana's ICT legislative architecture, including the Data Protection Act, Electronic Communications Act, and the Electronic Transactions Act. So Teki, welcome, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Next, we have Desmond Israel. He's senior lecturer in law and the head of public law and governance department at the Ghana Institute of Management and Public Administration Law School. He's also a partner at Agnos Legal, specializing in cyber law and technology. With 2 decades of cybersecurity experience and more than half of a decade at the bar, he advises governments, regulators, and financial institutions on cybersecurity, data protection, AI governance, and digital rights. He's a research fellow at the Center for AI and Data Policy and recognized for advancing Africa-centered approaches to digital governance and institutional resilience. So Desmond, thank you so much also for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you for having me, Tiffany. Thank you.
And next up, Stephen Kang. He's Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at the National Communications Authority of South Sudan, where he leads national cybersecurity readiness, incident response coordination, and regulatory development. He is passionate about advancing secure digital transformation in emerging economies and serves as chairperson and national coordinator of the South Sudan Internet Governance Forum. His work supports regional efforts to harmonize cybersecurity, digital trust, and data protection frameworks across East Africa and the wider continent, contributing to global dialogue on cross-border cyber risk and trust building in Africa's evolving digital economy. So as I mentioned before, we're going to be moving through 3 pillars of this conversation. And so now I want to jump in. So Desmond, I'd like to start with you. 2025 was called the Year of the Teeth for African data protection enforcement, and 2026 is now picking up where that left off. Ghana's Cybersecurity Authority has recently moved into strict enforcement of its licensing regime. That was back in January, just a couple months ago. So my question to you here is, what's the biggest gap that you see between Ghana's laws as they're written and then how they're operationalized on the ground?
All right, thank you. So I just speak from an interactive perspective with the work that I have done with professionals, advisory to clients and all that. I think the first issue has to do with whatever value proposition that the policy that led to these legal regimes, I don't think there is a better clarity as to what the value proposition is. It's more like you exist to practice cybersecurity, so we want to regulate you. I've looked at some of the documents, and the justification that I get from some of these readings tend to look at if we regulate the practitioners and the businesses, then we could guarantee security of the environment. That's another fallacy, because even if you're regulating people, they can still go rogue. So from a cybersecurity point of view, if that is the real purpose for the law, then I think that the regime did not address the value proposition very well. There are a number of practitioners, and this comes from platforms that I belong to, who find it very difficult to go through this licensing process merely because the first question they ask is, what do I get? What do I get? How does this leverage me to the market existence? Then there's a problem with efficiency in the system of registration itself. It can be cumbersome. It took me about 3 years to actually get the registration out. And this was from 2022 all the way to 2024 before I could get licensing. I don't know what's happening, but I have the records to prove this, from my email communications to references, to the inconsistency of documents that were required for you to do your registration and all that. And I'm addressing this purely from the point of view that you want to leverage what the reality is. I'm not after the law per se. The reality is that you have inefficiency with the system registration. There are team members that I needed to work on projects today who have not been able to register, through no fault of theirs. In fact, I do have examples of people who have actually paid money to the authority, and they are still waiting for a purported validation of their documents and all that, and I think these are the realities that makes it difficult. So do I put this team member on my project or not? What does it mean in law when I put them on the project? Am I violating the law? But what does it mean to my client who also needs this level of efficiency to get the job done? Now, away from that is also the issue of barrier of entry and, of course, market exclusion. There are people who argue that, well, it's a law and lawyers are required to have licenses before they go and practice. I think lawyers are pretty much clear what this licensing is for. Indeed, we can also argue that lawyering by itself creates a natural market for you. Once you're called to the bar, there is a place you can go and ply your trade. That is not what happens with cybersecurity. Indeed, people go and even study from all manner of places and pick up all sorts of security certifications across the world. So if you want to license them, if you want to manage them, then you also want to manage the barrier of entry and the market exclusion, from your policy point of view, even before the law should kick in effect. And the last point I'll make on this particular issue has to do with the cost burden. For the average person working, it's quite a lot of money to put in there to register, just so you could be recognized as a cybersecurity practitioner. So yes, we've set out well by having the law itself. It's a law that I have reviewed. Of course, I'm not part of the legislative process, but I've committed the last 4 years of my life to research. These are documents that I have looked at vis-a-vis other documents in other jurisdictions, and even countries that we have referenced to be the baseline for us, countries like Singapore and the rest. they do things differently. So if that's where the inspiration is coming from, then I think that there's a little misalignment between the law as it is and the enforcement specifically to do with the licensing of cybersecurity professionals and providers. There are other aspects of the law that we can argue against. It's going after people who are engaged in sextortion, child sexual, exploitation content, and all that. Is giving some level of leverage and discipline to critical information infrastructure. So yes, I don't want to be misquoted to saying it's a terrible law. No, there are aspects of it that actually brings us to the table as practitioners, as policymakers, researchers, and gives us a fair playing grade. There are also aspects of it, like I've mentioned, specifically to do with the licensing, that is pretty much problematic from where I sit. I think that would be my first position on that.
Could you I want to just pause there because I'd love to dig a little more deeply into that point around licensing. I understand that as of January 31st, 2026, there is now a potential criminal violations should a cyber professional, a cyber establishment, and a cyber service provider not have the appropriate credentials. And I'm just wondering, in your experience, where are you seeing that land now, particularly in light of the newness of this enforcement regime?
Right. So, I mean, people are taking steps to comply, but as we speak, I can tell you that not everybody is compliant, right? There are people out there still delivering services. In fact, there are organizations who are still leveraging on unlicensed people to deliver services. I know the argument will be that, well, that's the risk that they take. But your question is pretty clear. Where are we with these enforcement for criminal liability, for instance? I only know that the authority intends to come out with enforcement and also implement its sanctions. In my organization, we make sure we comply. I'm personally licensed as a tier 1, but that does not stop talking about the critical issues that comes with it. So yes, licensing is ongoing, and yes, there are people without licenses who are still delivering services. You understand?
Sure.
And so we need to find a way to truly bridge that gap, and that's why I started from the policy incentive by itself. So we are not all there. Maybe over time, half a decade or more, we'll get to the point where we'll come to the table where these aligns. One of the main issues that I also realized is we liken this regime to that of security clearance in the United States. That is apples against oranges. Security clearance is clearly access to a certain national security classification of systems that you can access. It is not a license for you to practice cybersecurity. At least I spent some time in the States, all the way to doing research that mattered in development of cybersecurity and AI. So I speak of these issues with authority. You understand? And so we can't do that comparison. It's not the same. We should look at our regime and make sure that we have enhanced the regime to the benefit of the people, and we have the structures there to ensure that the enforcement, or if you like, the uniform enforcement is applied. Because I can spend X amount of Ghana cedis to get a license that somebody do not have, but will still get the business anyways. And that's my point.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that point. And I think that's a really good segue to Techie. Desmond is describing a mature framework that seems to underperform in actual practice, right? You were sworn in as the chairperson of the DPC last July, right in the middle of this enforcement shift when the teeth and the biting, so to speak, was really coming into play. And so from your vantage point, how do you see that landscape evolving?
Yes, and because you've mentioned the role that I'm playing, let me come in with a disclaimer that the views I'm sharing here are solely my views as an expert in this space and does not represent any institution that I sit on as well. So when you look at the cybersecurity and data protection risk landscape, it is indeed evolving. And we've come a very long way. And when I say a long way, I'm counting back to 20 years ago, and when nobody knew what data protection or privacy is to where we are now. Now, we're increasingly seeing the relevance of these legislative regimes and frameworks because increasingly it's becoming clear that our citizens are not left behind in terms of the harms of not having the right framework in place would cause. Having said that, I think that in terms of how we are implementing these frameworks, we're also missing the big point, which is what is the mischief that these frameworks were set up to achieve, right? I think we are at a point where I would say we are majoring in the minors and minoring in the majors. And if you look at in order to really see this, you want to ask yourself, with all these legislative frameworks, what are we seeking to achieve with these? Do we want an ecosystem where we are able to minimize cybersecurity risks, where we are able to minimize data protection risks? I believe that is the ultimate objective of a number of these frameworks. Have we been able to effectively achieve this? I would say no. And I'm not just talking about Ghana, I'm also talking across Africa. Because I think we're looking at these things wrong. What are we enforcing? A lot of these legislative frameworks are looking into issues that I think are not necessary. They are important, but they are not those issues that will necessarily address mitigating those risk factors. I'm not going to belabor some of the examples that Desmond had just mentioned as well. But let's even look at the data protection landscape, right? There's a lot of focus across the broader digital rights landscape around compliance. And compliance has become a checklist. I'm not saying compliance is bad, but compliance has become a checklist where if I get my certification, I'm in the, best of places. And the frameworks that are actually required to ensure that this compliance helps us mitigate the risk is missing. And so my point is that while it is evolving, I also think that we need to take a step back and ask ourselves the big question, which is, why did we come up with these legislative frameworks in the first place? And are we really meeting the reasons, right? If the objective is to ensure that personal data of individuals are protected adequately, are we doing that? Is the person that is registered beyond that registration, beyond that accreditation, beyond that licensing, well equipped to actually protect the ordinary citizen? And I think that is what is missing. And invariably, it's not even an enforcement, it's not even going to help us achieve these if we do not put together all the let me call them salient requirements that are actually critical to ensure that you have an adequate ecosystem that is able to mitigate the risk. And that does not only come from licensing, as we have seen, or accreditation, or those are necessary. But what you need are people that are well aware, people that are well trained, infrastructure that is set up in a way that can enable and ensure also that your citizens are not left behind, right? They are well aware of their rights. Your judicial system is equipped and enabled to ensure that where rights are violated or these laws are violated, we would put in the necessary penal measures to ensure that these ordinary people or citizens are adequately protected. I don't think, we are meeting a lot of that. And that's why I am saying that we are majoring in the minors. So there are so many factors to ensure that the risk landscape is adequately mitigated beyond just having the legislative frameworks. And I think that even with the legislative frameworks and their implementation, we are stuck. Maybe for the right reasons, right? Because we are not resourcing the entities, and so they need resources. So they say, come pay money, let me license you. And so a lot of the time that drive to maybe raise enough resources to enable them do their work is there. And those resources, it means also that who are those people that are sitting there? Are they well trained? Do they understand the subject matter? These are very complex and sophisticated issues, right? And you don't even need one skill set to address it. So, yeah, that's just to say that I think there's a lot more work that we need to do. And for me, it's time that we take a step back to ask ourselves whether the purpose for which we pass these legislations are actually being met.
I love that response. That was a very robust response, but in particular, I loved majoring in the minus. I think that is a very powerful descriptor. And that leads me to believe or see this as, maybe last year, right, was the year of the teeth. This year, maybe per your philosophy, Techie, it could be the year of convergence, right? We need to make sure we're bringing to the table the infrastructure, those who understand awareness, training, skills, so on and so forth, right? To really be able to make that impact and push forward the types of legislation and protections, right, that are most important for the continent. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that piece. Thank you. I wanted to shift now to Stephen. Stephen, Techie and Desmond obviously just covered off on describing challenges of enforcing mature frameworks. And I wanted to pull you in here because you're starting at a very, very different point. You're in South Sudan, and you're a regulator of one of the youngest nations whose independence came to light only since 2011. So I wanted to explore with you, what are the barriers to moving frameworks like the Malabo Convention and AFTA's Digital Trade Protocol from paper to practice? Did we lose Stephen? It looks like we lost Stephen. So we will table that question and come back to it. What I did want to do before we move over to our next pillar, I wanted to talk a little bit about a cross-panel exchange. Luckily, I'm kicking off with Techie and Stephen. So we heard many different versions of the same challenge, right? The gap between mandate and capacity. So Techie, Ghana has the laws, the institutions. I was curious, what's the harder problem? And Stephen, he's in a different starting point in that he's building both, right? So in your view, what's the harder problem, enforcing what you already have or building it right from the beginning?
That's a hard question. I would say it's both. Enforcing what you have and building it from the beginning. I say both because you need to start right, right? You need to start it right by having the right resources, let me put it that way. The legislative framework is one thing. And if there's anything that I have learned in this space, it's a highly evolving space.
Yep.
And for all of us in the space, it's a continuous learning as well. And so what it means is that in building, in implementing, in enforcing, you must have the capacity to
Yep.
appreciate that landscape. And I think that any regulator in this space must have that capacity. That means that being technically well resourced, being financially well resourced, and then, in terms of course, the legislative framework as well. But here I'm moving on the assumption that you have a good law. And I'm at a place where when it comes to that, I say that a law is as good as the implementer of the laws. Because if you look at the legislations in this landscape, I think that it provides very, very minimal approaches, and you need to be very innovative to be able to effectively implement that. So yes, there is an issue of a gap, but also there's a challenge in terms of, are we even resourcing our institutions to enable them do their work well? I think there's another thing that is not even coming to the table that we're not talking about. And I see that a lot across Africa. There is that tendency. I remember many years ago in my telecom law class, and I say this to anybody I have an opportunity to speak to, that one of the first things we were taught is that you do not regulate technology, you do not legislate technology, you legislate appropriate behavior.
Yes.
And that is very fundamental for how laws are developed. And that is why a law the same law can be applied for 100 years and not much will change with it. I think that we are at the point in time where we're running after, we're chasing the legislations with the laws, and that is never enough. We're chasing the technologies with the laws, right? And that is never enough. We need to start thinking around, how do we use what we have? First of all, ask the question, what I have currently, is it able to sustain the technologies that I'm deploying or using now? If it is not, where are the gaps? And what are the things that I need to put in place to ensure that I'm able to address those gaps? I don't think we are asking enough of those questions and working, that way. And a lot, to be able to do that effectively, you have to have the right capacity. And I also think that is where we are missing, because we're not putting in, the training and the skill set that is required to enable us answer these questions objectively. Another issue is that we need to understand that with the evolving landscape and the convergence of these technologies, there is that risk to say that, oh, let's bring everybody together. Let's have one law that is going to govern everything. And that is a very high risk, because then you are putting square pegs in round holes, if I should put it that way, assuming that you want to legislate how AI technology is being deployed in the medical field. and you decide that, let's say, I'm going to use the data protection regulator as an AI regulator, they lack in that skill set to be able to even understand regulation of the medical landscape effectively, because it's a totally different sector with different rules and modalities that apply there. And so I'm just saying that we really need to look at these things holistically as a continent and as countries to ensure that when it comes to, and that is also going to help us with the capacity, right? So you're realistically going to ask yourself, what am I doing here? Do I have the resources to enable me effectively interpret and implement this law to the best, to the benefit of my citizens? And, let me just park this here. I think Stephen is back, so.
Yeah, Stephen, I'm not sure if you heard the question that I had just posed, but I'd said that, in the prior bits of our conversation in Pillar 1, we had talked about the different versions of the same challenge, right? The gap mandate and capacity. Techie has told us a lot about, laws and the institutions. You, I know, are kind of building both at the same time. And I was just curious about your view, in just a couple of minutes, what's the harder problem, enforcing what you already have or building it right from the beginning?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. And thank you for other colleagues as well for picking up while I was away for a moment. To me, the biggest gap actually is not the legislation, meaning it's not the absence of framework. It would be rather institutional and institutional capacity and coordination efforts. Many frameworks like the Malabo Convention assume that, for example, all the countries in Africa have mature institutions, which is not correct, and also assume that we do have the skilled workforce and clear mandates. But the reality is we do have a limited, technical capability or technical capacity. Even if we do have that capacity, it at different stages. For example, different countries have different level of maturity when it comes to the skilled workforce, the clear mandates of regulators, and the clear, interagency coordination. And also, as a challenge, in reality we do have overlapping mandates. For example, for the finance regulator and the telecom regulator. We also have low awareness among the operators, so in reality, in practice, what we do face here on the ground is more of, those, aspects I've mentioned rather than the absence of the laws or frameworks in place. So compliance is also is not yet a culture, but it's rather still evolving. Cybersecurity is seen as a cost center, not as a risk management. So regulators do face a challenge when working with, implementing this, cybersecurity measures that need to be implemented by operators, for example, because most will see it as a cost center rather than a risk management. So these are the few that I can highlight out of this one, but our challenge is not understanding what to do, basically. It is building the systems, the skills, and the coordination that we actually needed to implement those legislation. I'll end it here.
Thank you. That's a great response. And I want to pick that back up a little bit further in another pillar. So thank you for that. I want to shift now to Pillar 2, digital sovereignty and cross-border integration. Excuse me. So we've been talking about the gap, right, between law and practice. And now I want to pull on a tension that sits underneath all of this, which is sovereignty, right? Data localization, data embassies, sovereign clouds, hybrid models. These are more than technical choices. They're actually expressions of how a country thinks about control, resilience, and where power should actually sit. So, Stephen, I wanted to kick it off with you. You raised the concept of data embassies in our prep, and I think it's one that the audience would really have value hearing more from you about this. So could you walk us through what that means, how it balances data localization with cross-border cooperation, and then also how does it help, when cyber threats really don't respect borders? Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, thank you. Allow me to just to start with a brief one. In reality, sovereignty is not about where the data sits. It's about who controls the data.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So now, when we're talking about sovereignty, it's not a binary choice. No, it is about risk-based data governance. So we can categorize the data into two. Let's say critical or sensitive data that requires local control, that most countries would like to have that data hosted locally. We have the concept of data localization. And then we have the operational and commercial data, where now we need to allow flexible data flows. So now, let's say if we're talking about insurance or data, medical data records, for purpose of insurance, for purpose of treatment, the particular patient data need to be transferred across border so that to enable certain operational processes to take place. So because of that, the cyber threats are cross border because all of us we agree we need the data to move across border for operational purposes, for commercial, and so on. Now, accountability remains national because at the end of the day, if South Sudan allows, for instance, a citizen data, for example, to cross the border and go to Ghana, if there is a breach of that data, the citizen hold their government accountable, meaning the government of South Sudan, not the government of Ghana. So where here the question comes in, how do we ensure the sovereignty or the safety of that data? So now this requires strong legal agreements and trusted international partnerships. So on data embassy is promising on those two main aspects I've mentioned. So how that happens, just as the name implies, data embassies, like any embassies, we do understand when a country or a state have an embassy in another country, they are given certain protocols in terms how they are treated, and technically that the territory where the embassy sits is basically considered as an extension of that particular nation. So now,
Okay.
in the context of data, this is what happens. So, for example, let's say South Sudan have limited infrastructure in terms of hosted data, and they opted to host data, for example, let's say in Rwanda. How do we assure? So we can have an agreement where we use the concept of data embassies, where South Sudan can host their data in Rwanda, physically in Rwanda, but technically the control and ownership of data is still remains or is still maintained its sovereignty with the government of South Sudan or particular entity that has this data. So this allows for what I have highlighted in my first answer, the limited capacity, the infrastructure gaps that we do have in Africa. So for us to enforce harmonized laws and harmonized mechanism in place, we will face that gap so that we can equip countries or emerging economies that have less capabilities in terms of infrastructure and security mechanism. We can utilize such concepts, and I'm sure it will be helpful. I'll end it here. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, you just closed with companies that have less capabilities and infrastructure, and I wanted to now direct this to Desmond. Excuse me. Stephen has described a sovereignty mechanism for countries at an earlier infrastructure stage, right? Now, Desmond, you flagged that even Ghana's government data centers are not scaling, and mobile money still routes through international cloud services. And then obviously we all saw what happened during the 5-day connectivity disruption about a year or two ago. So I was curious, how should Ghana be thinking about data localization versus some of the hybrid approaches that may be available? And what does that disruption reveal, the connectivity disruption reveal about a country's ability to be resilient?
Right. Okay. So I think Steve did a very good job talking about the data embassies. Now, in the context of data localization, the mechanism of control is always not just about the data. It's also about the infrastructure. And then in the age of AI, it's also about algorithmic control. Because the data could sit in your country with all the, permit me to borrow the term, with all the noise that you make about localization. And when somebody plugs it into some AI module, that data is going to leave that jurisdiction in seconds. So the whole conversation about data localization has shifted to that era. Now, in terms of infrastructure, I think it also had to do with data classification, largely from a national point of view. What sort of data do we want to sit within jurisdiction? And that is matched to risk. Risk in the sense of, if you like, look at it from a critical information infrastructure perspective, because that gives you a better idea what a country considers as important to them infrastructure-wise from the risk perspective. So critical information infrastructure, we understand once is such a system that if it gets interrupted or it goes down or it gets damaged, then the economic well-being of citizens will be impacted, right? Or the financial system or national security or things like that. So from that perspective, you then had to agree where does the data that supports this particular aspect of the state, where does it sit? Where do we want to control it from? Now, in our case, look, the infrastructure conversation will go on for 2 decades more. That's my prediction, because we need to put our money where our mouth is. We need to spend more to put in the kind of infrastructure that the likes of, if you take Microsoft, the AWS and the Google, the kind of infrastructure that they've put up, right? So if we intend to own infrastructure, then that's a huge conversation in terms of investment. I'm not saying it can't happen, but that's why I'm saying probably the next 2 decades. And that is if we are serious about having that level of infrastructure. But I'm also an advocate for cloud sovereign or sovereign clouds, which follows this idea of data embassies. And I always reference the example of France and Germany. These things are working, they are running. And the application of the various legislative regime and the control that comes with some of these infrastructure is part of the agreement to get in there. So Delios is one, Blue is one, and these are very good case studies. If you really want to discuss cloud sovereign or sovereign cloud, these are case studies you should study first, because they answer most of the questions that a lot of people have. Who controls it? Who is in charge? The only thing that you are provided at this stage is someone has done the investment in the infrastructure and you are leveraging, so you don't end up being late. You can catch up real quick. So taking, for instance, mention about the healthcare sector, you want your healthcare sector, to be caught off in terms of data sovereignty, data localization. Where do you want it to sit? Because Steve gave us a clear direction as to what these localization and sovereignty is about. It's about control. So but we want to move the data to sit where exactly and for what purpose. And then it kicks in all the different regulations that comes with it. Now, in terms of disruption of infrastructure, let's not go too far. Just recently, we had a telecom disruption. And I think I mentioned this in our prep talk. That disruption lasted us for 5 days. And I was on record to be having this conversation and even making very wild examples and saying that if our neighbor in Cote d'Ivoire decided to go rogue and take us off the grid, what's the resilient plan? And I was on call at the time with one of the politicians who did not see that can ever happen, because his answer suggests that, oh no, this is not something that you can be looking at now. Really? This is something you should be discussing today, because it has to do with infrastructure, the bedrock of your connectivity. And if we are not able to, and the US did it, they have a cable security guideline. In fact, the cable security framework that covers all the way to investment into repair ships, because
Right.
they understand what it means for one connectivity to go off without redundancy. So you can't be discussing data sovereignty, which is the point I finally want to make. You can't be discussing data sovereignty, data localization, when infrastructure itself, you don't have any leverage in terms of resilience on infrastructure. The data is still going under the sea, and if you are not considering your geopolitical risk to some of these things, then let's not have a conversation about sovereignty at our level, really, what exactly do we want to sovereign over? What is the control mechanism? So I answer your question by saying that let's go back to the point Steve made. Control, and let's address data control, infrastructure control, and infrastructure control does not mean the servers should sit here. That is why I mentioned sovereign cloud, for instance, as an example. If we have the investment to do it and we want to cut off, then we should also answer international questions like in the case of Africa Continental Free Trade. Because there's a digital trade protocol annexed to these documents, which clearly envisages that we are going to engage ourselves, if you like, in electronic commerce. And you want to speak about data localization. So we need to fuse that into all the other obligations that we need to, come to the table with. And then in summary, once you have decided what sort of data should move around, what sort of data should stay, you can design the architecture. So when I made the example about mobile money applications going all the way to the internet, it was one of the flaws we realized when we were taken down for 5 days without internet, because most of those apps which were leveraging on some of the infrastructure were not working. And that's
Right.
when the designers of this system realized that, so every time I do a simple transaction, I go all the way to the internet before coming back to base. But if there were cached systems in-house, and when I say in-house, I'm talking about present in Ghana, you see, that would make business and economic sense.
Sure.
For the data localization, because what you're doing is actually addressing access gap with the data localization. So the conversation should not be generally about data localization and the fact that we fancy to keep our data in here and that's it. Let's go back to the control conversation and then juxtapose that to our national perspective as to policy, where do we want to go, security issues, geopolitical risk, and all that. And then we can drive home the architecture, which should give us a much better solution.
No, I love that. And credit to Stephen for calling out this concept of control. Thank you, Desmond, for kind of supporting that in your philosophy as well. And I wanted to now, we're talking about control. I wanted to turn this now to Techie, because Techie has been working on the legislative side of this for years. A number of us here are lawyers, right? And so we know that oftentimes control starts with the law, right? And so I'm just curious, from a governance perspective, Techie, what governance arrangements are realistically needed to balance sovereignty with these issues of cross-border data flows under AFTA's digital protocol? I think you may be on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yes.
That's okay.
Before I go on to that, I just wanted to add to that Africa's digital sovereignty must be, I always say that we need to critically think through what exactly we want and what we mean by digital sovereignty. I believe we have to closely define agency in that context. We have to closely define control. We have to closely define autonomy in order to make that a reality. In terms of what frameworks we require when it comes to, definitely, yes, having a legislative framework is a key thing. But more importantly, I would speak of enforcement and again, coming back on the back of what I had said earlier, we must look at very holistic enforcement to ensure that, we're looking at what needs to be looked at. And we understand what our challenges are beyond the infrastructure and all of that, to make sure that we're actually enforcing the legislations that we are putting in place. Now, in order to do that effectively, we need to ensure that we're funding, putting our monies where our mouth is. funding the resources that are required. We are building the technical capacity. We are ensuring that there is cooperation mechanisms that are actually built into our ability to enforce these frameworks, both internally and externally, especially if you want to look at cross-border data flows. Also key to this, we have to make sure that whether we are building, these sovereign or regional data infrastructure, a lot of thought goes into what exactly we are building. And I say that my biggest challenge when I look at some of the, let me call it, conversations, particularly around digital sovereignty and all of that, is that it's very difficult when you look at policies across Africa to see governments deliberately prioritizing, right? It is very clear that in our parts of the world, we have limited resources that cannot go everywhere. And yet, most of our policies are very general in nature. I'm not saying it's bad, but it looks like what everybody else is doing. If you typically look at policies around this, it may not be different from what developed economies are looking like, but we have very different and peculiar problems. And so I believe that building these governance frameworks, we have to be very deliberate in making sure that they address our specific issues. We also need to ensure that skills development, right, that is required to bring us along this path is actually there. A few years ago, I think a friend of mine made a comment on LinkedIn where there was, as usual, a very interesting project was launched. And she was very skeptical about it and was asking, where is the capacity? Don't come to me with all these grandiose ideas when you don't have the required resources to implement it. Because for her, and I think she's very right, we need to be really sitting down and saying that, am I cutting my cloth according to my size? And move away from all these, and they're nice ideas, nice to have ideas, but a lot of the time it's very clear that we do not have the capacity. We also need to ensure that in having these frameworks and arrangements, there is strong regional alignment. We have had regional alignment in talks. And when I say in talks, when you look on paper from the regional and continental frameworks that we have, there is alignment, there is that perception that our governments want to work together, our countries want to move together, we want to share data across platform. But in reality, all you need to do is just scratch the surface. And you would see that we are sitting at different points, which is also one of the biggest challenges, because if you want to even address issues of sovereignty and all of that, the best way we can do it, especially for the likes of AI, is to pull resources together. But once we are not speaking on the same issues, right? On the surface, it looks like we're on the same course, but together there is misalignment. And those divergence and differences is also creating a big challenge in terms of building the right governance frameworks that can enable us effectively achieve digital sovereignty and even, cross-border data flows, so to speak.
Thank you, Teki. And your comments, I think, are a great lead into an audience question that came in. And Stephen, this might be something that you'd be well suited to respond to as well. The individual states, as someone who has personally experienced the impact of cybersecurity threats, and coming from a country where less than 20% of the population has awareness of cybersecurity, he'd like to know the following. What practical steps can African governments and institutions take to build digital trust among citizens, particularly in environments where the awareness of cybersecurity risks remains low?
Yes, thank you. I think this is a very interesting question, and I would like to answer from a personal experience. You see, in the question, there is a keyword. If we look critically, the keyword there is trust. How do government build trust? Meaning there is a gap that the common people do not trust, for example, let's say a service on the internet. I will give you an example. When we introduce digital financial services in the form of mobile money, which is basically a digital wallet, but runs on the telecom network, and where you can have your money and being pushed and pulled from the wallet to your respective bank accounts and vice versa, which in our context, especially here in East Africa, have been very successful in terms of providing digital inclusion. But there now, someone will ask a question like, how safe is my money sitting on a phone? From just a very ordinary person. How do you provide trust? Yes. How do you provide trust for such people? How do you provide trust? How do you build that trust, that they trust that their money, which is just sitting on a phone, is safe? You know, in the case of a bank, they know the bank where the bank is located. So in case anything happens, they can go physically to the bank and do the money. But now your money is inside the phone. And I'm speaking from just a common man perspective here. So this is something which requires, first of all, awareness, a lot of awareness. I gave that example to answer that question. First of all, that particular country need to identify the gaps. Because when you look at the cybersecurity landscape, it's very broad. You know, each country, each community, each ecosystem have different challenges and different ways of solving those challenges. So if we identify the gap, then we look into the practical solution, starting with awareness. And then for the case of, for example, these digital financial services, then to build the trust, you need to show them that you are also able to secure their money and able to have a reactive and proactive mechanism in place so that in case anything happens, you are able to support them. And this case for South Sudan, for example, we have just recently finished setting up what we call a digital financial services security lab, which is in collaboration with the International Telecommunication Union, which basically build a local capability here where we are able to test and verify that these mobile money services are safe and they are secure based on the USSD level that is on the network and also on at the mobile application level. And we work on that in collaboration with the Bank of South Sudan, which is a financial regulator, where we provide that security assurance. And then we work on awareness where that, things to do with SIM, for example, SIM fraud, SIM swap, why is it necessary for you to make sure your SIM is registered on your name? You should not, share your password, some things like this. So there are practical solutions. I gave that example. It could be any other example in that particular area for that particular country. But I would say start with identifying the gaps, the stakeholders involved, do the awareness, see what practical mechanism that could be done. For example, from the operators point of view, from the regulator point of view, and eventually, we are able to put mechanism in place. Because in cybersecurity, we cannot have 100% assurance. We can always put measures and countermeasures so that we can also react when things go south. Thank you. I'll end it here.
Thank you. And I hope that satisfies Mohammed's inquiry. Another question that came through, and I want to give this to Desmond. The question is, at what point does the pursuit of cybersecurity begin to compromise the very freedom and rights it's meant to protect?
Hi.
I believe Desmond is frozen.
It's privacy.
Oh. Feedback? All right, we'll get back when Desmond. Oh,
Can you hear me?
yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. All right. I think I had the connection lag briefly. Okay.
No
So
worries.
I'm saying that question, comes down to national security versus privacy. That's the bottom line. That whatever controls we put in there, do we have visible oversight, so that when there are excesses, we can track them and we can deal with them. So for instance, if you have a Cybersecurity Act that gives interception privileges to law enforcement, it actually means that in the cases where it suits their investigation or their work, they can actually call for capability to intercept your communication. That can also be looked at from a perspective where if we are trying to fight crime, we would need the same capability. So maybe because of the way I'm trained in these things, but I'm not against entirely having national security capabilities in your cybersecurity infrastructure, because part of the regime of democracy is for a state to be able to take care of its citizens. But I'm entirely against a regime that has absolutely no checks and balances on the excesses that these capabilities can actually give the law enforcement or the bodies that be. Take, for example, a potential legislation that would be passed that do not require a law enforcement agency to get a warrant from court before they could, for instance, if you like, go through digital devices, digital media for the purposes of trying to track misinformation. For me, the policy rationale behind that law is not justified enough for law enforcement or authorities that be to have these blanket sort of power to be able to use those capabilities. There's a reason why you are required to go to court, because as a people, we have given those powers to the court. So when you go to the courts, you are seeking a judicial blessing to be able to take away my rights. That's it. That's the rationale behind that. So it's out of line for anybody, no matter how much power they have in government, to seek to pass legislations, for instance, that gives cybersecurity capabilities that is unchecked. And that's where my problem would actually lie. Apart from that, like I said, the state must protect its people. So you're looking at potential terrorists. We had the Apple case, for instance, in the US, when the FBI wanted to, get access to the Apple device of the suspect because of his terrorist activities. But Apple refused to give access. But if you look at those facts well, it was not just a blanket refusal of access. Apple says, we have actually given you all that you asked for already. We've given you cloud information, user information, everything that you need. What you are asking of us now is to create a bypass for you that will not only affect this particular subject. It means anybody who uses Apple phone, when you want to bypass the security, you could do that. And for that purpose, we are not going to give you access. And I think the tribunal was also in favor of Apple until the FBI found a third party to, in want of a better word, hack the device and then bring back the information.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty much where my mindset is when it comes to do states need to acquire cybersecurity capabilities? Oh, yes, I think they do. We are in a space of cyber warfare. I'm writing a paper about that, and I'm making these same arguments about states being able to have the capability to protect their citizens. The cyber warfare regime, it's also going to be tied to our geopolitics. So
Right.
if you are aligned to country A and country B is against country A and they are going after them, they're going to find out all other infrastructures that are connected to you that they can cause disruption, similar to what they are doing in the kinetic warfare. If I block the strait, Oil is not going to come to you. You starve. We all starve together. Same regime is going to happen in the cyberspace. So countries must invest in getting these capabilities, but they can't acquire these capabilities and then in peacetime, they use it against their citizens. I think that is something that any regime should be able to deal with. And I'm talking about the excesses.
Thank you, Desmond. And one more question that came through. This techie, this one's for you. Coming out of Pillar 2, an attendee has asked, from your experience, how can digital trust frameworks be practically applied to strengthen the use of routine health data, particularly for reaching zero close or underserved populations in low resource settings? You're on mute.
I think I need to get out of this space of not muting or muting my, yeah. Yes, so the frameworks are ideally supposed to work. But I'm approaching this very cautiously, because one of the things that I have realized in the last, let's say, decade, and I'm now beginning to question some of the laws that we even worked on back in the day, right, is to especially applying those, because these are very standard global frameworks as well. But without the, call it maybe without the technical capabilities, or it's not even a technical capabilities, but with the special dispensation of our countries, should we be applying these laws, or should we have put in our requirements very differently? And yes, these laws are very general in nature. And so what it means is that, like I said, they are there to cure a mischief, right? So the approaches of these laws are not to say that they are saying protect the citizens. They are saying ensure that your citizens are safe. They are saying that help build capacity of your citizens so that where they are required to protect themselves, they themselves are able to do that. But when you have a very huge population, right, that are illiterate, so a significant portion, let's say majority of your population, fall within the vulnerable, they fall within the group that do not lacks maybe formal education and all of that. The question is, how do you ensure that these tools are made available to them in a way that can ensure their protection? And I think that is where the gap has been. So I think that we need to be able to bring these laws or implement these laws, whether for the health sector, down to the level of our citizens, as ordinary as they come, right? So that we can, and that also means that we need to move away from, and I say this a lot, I'm in the data protection space. There's the likelihood for us to come and scream, and I've even seen it with Momo. So currently, even at ADRH, we're working a lot around how to simplify implementation to ensure that citizens are safe. I think we need to move away from putting a lot more obligation on our citizens, to ensuring that we're putting resources and innovation into building tools that enable our citizens with the capabilities that they have. That's to say that if you want to protect the privacy of a 2-year-old, right? the same tools that you're providing to the 50-year-old will be very different from what you're providing to. And I think that the existing frameworks are good enough, but we probably need to strengthen them to ensure that those that are in charge of making sure we're complying with these are pushing for more of these frameworks so that the ordinary person would be protected. What does that mean? It means if you're providing a platform in the medical space, who is going to use it? If it's and the interesting thing I see with technology is that especially today with AI and language models and all of that, that capability can easily be built in, right? So that my grandmother in the village without a formal education very well knows that this is what I need to do. More recently, I was talking to a large platform provider that was providing different levels of privacy security standards that can be applied, and it requires you to read. So my question for them is that looking at my continent, where majority of people cannot read your English and write it, this tool may be very useful, but it's almost as if you're not providing them with anything. And so for me, I think that we need to ensure that in building these health, call it frameworks, we build in the capabilities to ensure that there is protection at source. So there's whether cybersecurity by design or data protection by design, but also we factor in who we're building these tools for, right? So that at that point, we're giving them tools that they can use to ensure that that trust actually exists, because the digital trust framework is not a one-size-fits-all. The people that are using it play a role. The builder also plays a role in it. The regulators play a role. So I would say that you need to have a very holistic ecosystem that actually looks at your underserved populations and what their real challenges are and addresses those needs within that framework.
Thank you, Taki. That was a great response, and it's a great segue into our final pillar. We've talked about sovereignty and infrastructure, and I want to push a little bit with the time we have left into what I think the most uncomfortable piece is, what do you do when you can't control it all, right? We talked about AI here. Your grandmother living in a village how can she leverage technology to help her? So AI tools and platforms are increasingly global, and they're also outside national regulatory reach. And I wanted to turn to Desmond here. You've argued that existing frameworks can handle AI-related liability. And I wanted to push a little bit on that because Act 1038 covers cyber deception and unauthorized access. So my question to you is, how far can the Act realistically reach to cover some of the newer types of cyber issues and AI issues like deepfakes, automated fraud, and algorithmic bias?
Right. Okay. I think I'll feed off something Teki said in an earlier submission, which is that we don't legislate technology, we rather the behavior, right? Okay. Now, this question, I have answered these in an article that I wrote, which was published in the AI Law and Regulation Journal sometime last year. And I did use the Electronic Transactions Act of Ghana to make my argument. And in fact, I was surprised it got quite a feedback, because not a lot of people actually thought that Ghana had a law which was passed in 2008, which is pretty much progressive in the sense. Now, in our laws, we have defined what an electronic agent is, and we had connected it to automated transactions. We had defined criminal negligence. We had defined intent in our laws. I mean, I just brought just these few out to make the point from a lawyer's perspective. For you to be able to say a particular behavior is unlawful, it has to meet the test of law. So if you are issuing deepfake, and deepfake is going to fit here very well within what I'll call disinformation and malinformation, because misinformation is a low bar, if you ask me. So that might not really pass for a criminal test. But disinformation, where the intent is established as you meaning to use this technology to cost people, then we would have a legal regime that, in my view, to a larger extent, and if the court is minded to pay attention to some of these things, to be able to bring liability to bear. And when I made this argument, I did connected it to a case that happened in Canada, Moffat against Air Canada, where a subject, passenger, had attempted to buy, in fact, not attempted to, bought a ticket on Air Canada. And I'll make this very brief. And in the process of buying, he engaged a botnet. And the botnet answered to him that he could get his bereavement benefits at a particular point in time. Now, fast forward, Moffat now sought to, retrieve these benefits because the time is due. And he's now being told by Air Canada that he could not, because he dealt with a bot, and that he should have read the actual documents that covers bereavement. I love the decision of the tribunal, even though Canada did not have the sort of positioning in their law that we do. They use the common law for agency, liability, negligence, and all that to get to the point that Air Canada was liable to Moffat, right? And I have argued that that case would have just passed by a statutory test. We don't even need to go to common law. So you look at the regime of the regulation you have, and again, support Steki's point that how about assessing all your regulations, find out what can achieve what, and where are the gaps, so you proceed to address those gaps, rather than trying to pass laws all over again. In summing up, I'm saying that every single regime that has technology laws, electronic transactions, cybersecurity, data protection, must first test some of these upcoming, if you like, liabilities against their laws. It's not okay to just let it pass, whether by a policy brief, whether by proper legislation, whether by a debate, whichever test it is, in fact, all the way to a potential lawsuit. We should be able to look at these tests, because the harms that are coming out from AI, they are actually harms that existed. AI is exacerbating it and giving us gray areas. So we can't proceed to assume that, oh, it's AI that created deepfake, so there's no liability. I beg to differ.
I think that's a great point. Teki, I know you also feel strongly on this issue. Just for a couple of minutes, anything that you'd like to add or contribute on this point? Okay, got it.
I think my views around this have been aired quite a lot, and I had said that from the beginning. Especially when we're looking at AI, I believe that as countries we need to be very careful, and we're seeing this trend across Africa where everybody's talking about possibly AI legislation and all of that. Somehow we're also learning from Europe, but we have to be very mindful of our ecosystem and how what we move to adopt and what we do not move to adopt. Now, it's very clear that even if you look at Europe, right, with all these extensive digital services, all these new policies and frameworks, they're still struggling to address the issue, sometimes even under the very framework of the laws that have been repassed. Precisely because the challenges are also not necessarily law related, right? So we've seen how in certain cases, courts, particularly European courts, have taking decisions against major players in the space to say that your laws have even violated these provisions. But from the technical perspective, they would pass, use another route to say that, okay, that's fine, but they would still achieve the very same thing that the courts are saying they should not do, because, again, it goes to point that you're not necessarily, the laws are not always adequate, right, to address some of these. Some of the issues are technological issues. Some of the issues are just, let me call it societal issues, right? So assuming that I somehow I have become a de facto monopoly and by through no fault of mine, right? And you're saying that, okay, you've become a monopoly and you're using your system to violate, so open it up for everybody. Then I open my systems up to you, but I charge you a price that you cannot pay. And I say, oh, now it's open, everybody come and bid, right? And I myself will also bid for those same limited resources, but obviously you do not have the wherewithal to bid as much as I will do. This is where people would typically say that the law is an ass, right? Because it's not necessarily satisfying the point to which we're developing it. And that's why I would insist on saying that we need to be very, very careful in how we look at these things, especially because we put a lot of resources and time in developing these laws. And we have to be mindful about a number of things. One, what is the mischief that we are trying to cure? Now, if you look at the typical challenges that the AI ecosystem gives to our respective countries across Africa, they are very peculiar. There are infrastructure-related issues. There are digital sovereignty-related issues. Aspects of the digital sovereignty could be dealt with laws, but it's not all of them. There are capacity and skills gap issues, which is not a legal challenge. And no amount of legal framework beyond, even if you bind government to say that raise the capacity of every citizen to enable that, I do not even think we have the resources to do that, right? And that's to say that we need to prioritize and look critically rather than just jump in, because we, as a continent, we have very limited resources. And I don't think that, I also agree with Desmond in saying that, look, a lot of the laws we have not been fully tested. More recently, Ghana, there was a significant decision on violation of privacy from the Supreme Court of Ghana. And the interesting thing about it was that the case had been taken on purely on a foundation of violation of the right to privacy. However, one of the things that I have always been speaking about when I speak about data protection was that it was built to provide that level. And it was quite interesting to see how the Supreme Court, in arriving at the conclusion of violation of privacy, had hinted on obligations that arise from data protection and the lack of, the fact that the entity did not comply with those obligations under data protection ended up violating the right of privacy of the citizen. And so, again, we have to be very mindful. Let me use it that way. We have to be very mindful about these issues. And I think that when it comes to regulations in general, I think that we need to be very holistic as well. And when I say holistic, we need to look at these things from different perspectives, not just legal perspective. We have to be mindful of sectors we're working within. We have to be mindful of the citizens that we're developing these laws for. We have to be mindful of even the ecosystem, right? Is it right for these laws? Can we effectively implement? And I think those are the things that will help us come up with very robust laws that will stand the test of time.
Thank you, Teki. In the interest of time, I just wanted to close out quickly with a forward-looking question for each of you. Please cap your responses to 1 minute. And I'm going to start with Stephen. What's the biggest cybersecurity risk leaders are missing right now, and what's the first step for them to close that gap?
Well, thank you. To me, I think the biggest risk we are most likely facing now is over-reliance on external infrastructure without visibility or control. That applies to both what we have discussed on the implementation gaps and also now on the other parts of the AI. Example include cloud dependency, third-party platforms, and also the global SaaS, software as a service tools. So many leaders don't know where their critical data resides, and they don't understand these dependencies. I will end it here. Thank you.
Thank you. Desmond, 1 minute.
All right. So I'm still leveraging on the same point, third-party risk and dependency situations. We've seen a scenario all the way to independent security vendors. When there's a glitch, it affects global, supply chains. So third-party risk is one of the key things that we need to look at, even from a country level. The answer to that is more due diligence, and then also the fallback for the purposes of resilience.
I love that. I might follow up with you after the fact on the point of more due diligence. I'd love to kind of explore how you would map that out. And then last but certainly not least, Teki.
I think the biggest risk we face on the continent from where I sit is the lack of citizen awareness. And when I say that, I think we've approached our awareness from the point of view that we're dealing with citizens that are very knowledgeable and skilled. And I do not think that we have approached, the cybersecurity risk issues from the point of who am I dealing with really? So to me, I believe that is the biggest risk we overlook.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 minutes before we have to wrap up. But thank you to each of you for your really incredibly deep and informative responses. I loved the exchange that you were able to have and generate amongst each of you. So thank you for coming to the table. And again, we're coming up on time, so I just want to bring this to a close. So Desmond, Teki, and Stephen, thank you so much. This is exactly what I and Eunomia had planned for, a substantive, grounded, and honest conversation about where the challenges sit. I almost feel like we need to schedule a part 2 because there are more points we did not have the chance to get to. So stay tuned. I may be making some outreach, but also to everyone in the audience. We'll be synthesizing this conversation into a white paper over the coming weeks. And if you're not already on Eunomia's mailing list, you will receive information on how to access it. We would love to continue this engagement and the conversations that we're having. Many of you indicated an interest in CPD for today's program, so please just be sure that you complete your survey, which is a prerequisite to receiving your CPD credit. And then importantly, the next installment in this series will focus on technology governance and strategic communications in Africa. So more to come on that. The central theme will be AI governance. So looking forward to putting that program together and hopefully having many of you and more joining us for the next session. So thank you so much and have a wonderful morning, evening, or evening.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you, everyone.